Zarathil stood before the massive viewing screen in her office aboard Nexus Prime, her crystalline body shifting from pale blue to deep purple as waves of disgust rippled through her translucent skin. The images displayed before her showed creatures so hideous that she could barely force herself to keep looking. These were humans, the newest species seeking membership in the Galactic Council. Her elegant fingers, made of living crystal that caught and refracted the station's artificial light, trembled as she scrolled through the biological data. Each image was worse than the last. The humans had rough, uneven skin in various shades of brown and pink that looked diseased to her eyes. Their faces were completely asymmetrical, with features that seemed randomly placed. Most disturbing of all were the strange protein strands, growing from their heads and covering parts of their bodies like some kind of parasitic growth. Zarathil had served as a cultural liaison for the Chil Velfari people for over 200 cycles. Her job was to help other species understand and appreciate the refined beauty of her race. The Velfari were known throughout the galaxy as the most aesthetically perfect beings ever to achieve space travel. Their bodies were formed from living crystal that shifted colors based on their emotions, creating displays of incredible beauty. Every Velfari was perfectly symmetrical, with features that followed mathematical principles of harmony and balance. The thought of these ugly humans joining their civilized community made her entire being pulse with revulsion. She had already received reports from the Velfari Council of Aesthetics back on her homeworld. They had declared humans to be visually offensive and recommended that all Velfari avoid direct contact whenever possible. The council suggested that humans should be required to wear masking devices when in the presence of more evolved species. As she continued reviewing the human files, Zarathil noticed something that made her even more disturbed. The humans seemed completely unaware of their own ugliness. In their cultural records, she found images they called art, showing human faces and bodies as if they were something to be admired. They had concepts like beauty and attractiveness that they applied to their own kind. This level of self-delusion was almost pitiable. The communication device on her desk chimed with an incoming message from the station commander. The humans would be arriving in just 3 standard days for their first diplomatic meeting with the Galactic Council. All cultural liaisons were required to attend the welcome ceremony and help make the humans feel accepted in the galactic community. Zarathil felt her crystal form darken to an angry red color. The idea of standing in the same room as these creatures, of having to pretend they were worthy of respect, filled her with dread. She had heard that humans communicated partly through facial expressions, which meant she would have to look directly at their asymmetrical features and try to interpret their meaning. She opened her personal communication channel and sent a message to her friend Cathara, another Velfari stationed on a trading post near the Andromeda sector. Within minutes, a response appeared on her screen, and she could see Cathara's beautiful crystalline face looking back at her with concern. "I heard about the human arrival," Cathara said, her voice carrying the musical tones that made Velfari speech so pleasing to hear. "Are you really going to have to interact with them directly?" "The station commander insists all liaisons must participate," Zarathil replied, her own voice carrying notes of distress. "I have been studying their biological data for days, and each image is more horrifying than the last. How can such ugly creatures have achieved space travel? It defies all logic." Cathara's form shifted to a sympathetic shade of green. "Perhaps you could request a transfer before they arrive. Surely the commander would understand that exposing our people to such visual trauma is unreasonable." "I already tried," Zarathil said, her color deepening to frustrated purple. "He claims this is an important moment for galactic unity, and that all perspectives need to be represented. I think he secretly enjoys the idea of making us suffer through this ordeal." After ending the call, Zarathil spent the rest of her shift researching ways to minimize her exposure to human appearance. She discovered that several other species had already developed protective visors that could filter out the most disturbing aspects of human features. Some even had settings that could completely mask human faces and replace them with more aesthetically pleasing geometric patterns. She immediately ordered the most advanced visor available and had it delivered through the station's rapid transport system. When it arrived, she carefully adjusted the settings to maximum filtration. Through the visor, even the most hideous human images became tolerable, appearing as blurred, abstract shapes rather than the disturbing reality of their actual appearance. That evening, Zarathil attended a meeting of what had become known as the Human Containment Protocol. This was an informal group of representatives from various species who shared concerns about human integration into galactic society. The group met in a private conference room, deep within the station's residential sector. The meeting was led by Ambassador Vexter from the Zephyrian Empire, whose people valued order and perfection above all else. His metallic blue skin gleamed under the conference room lights as he addressed the gathered representatives. "We must take action to protect our civilized society from this invasion of ugliness," Vexter declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I propose that we demand humans wear full body coverings and voice modulators when in public spaces. Their appearance and primitive communication methods are disruptive to proper social order." Zarathil found herself nodding in agreement, along with most of the other attendees. A representative from the Crystalline Federation suggested that humans should be restricted to certain areas of stations and planets, keeping them separate from species with more refined sensibilities. Another proposed that all human diplomatic meetings should be conducted through holographic intermediaries to avoid direct visual contact. As the meeting progressed, Zarathil volunteered to draft a formal proposal outlining restrictions on human behavior and appearance within Galactic Council facilities. She would present this proposal to the station commander before the humans arrived, hoping to establish protective protocols for the more civilized species. Walking back to her quarters after the meeting, Zarathil felt a sense of purpose she had not experienced in many cycles. She was not just protecting her own aesthetic sensibilities, but standing up for the principles of beauty and refinement that had guided galactic civilization for millennia. The humans might have achieved space travel, but they clearly lacked the cultural development necessary to participate in truly civilized society. In her private quarters, surrounded by the soft, harmonious glow of Velthari crystal formations, Zarathil began working on her proposal. She would make sure that the other species on Nexus Prime were protected from the visual assault the human presence would bring. It was her duty as a cultural liaison and as a representative of one of the galaxy's most beautiful races. The docking bay of Nexus Prime had never seen such a crowd before. Representatives from dozens of species gathered in the massive chamber, their various forms creating a rainbow of colors, shapes, and sizes. Most wore protective visors or filtering devices over their visual organs, preparing themselves for their first sight of the humans who had just arrived aboard their vessel called Endeavor. Zarathil positioned herself near the front of the diplomatic welcoming party, her new protective visor securely fastened over her crystal-clear visual organs. Through the tinted barrier, the world looked slightly dimmer, but she knew it would protect her from the full horror of human appearance. Her crystalline body maintained a steady blue color, the shade of professional calm that Velthari diplomats were trained to display during difficult situations. Station Commander Horthic, a massive being from the Granite Collective, whose rock-like body towered over most other species, raised one enormous stone arm to signal for quiet. His voice rumbled through the chamber like distant thunder as he addressed the assembled crowd. "Today marks a historic moment in galactic civilization," he announced. though Zarathil noticed that his own visual sensors were equipped with filtering devices. We welcome the humans as potential members of our great community. Let us show them the hospitality and respect that defines our advanced society. The words sounded hollow to Zarathil, especially knowing that most of the beings present had come not to welcome the humans, but to witness what many expected to be a spectacle of primitive behavior. She had heard whispered conversations throughout the station over the past few days, with various species placing bets on how quickly the humans would offend someone or violate basic protocols of civilized conduct. The massive bay doors began to open with a deep mechanical grinding sound that echoed through the chamber. Beyond the opening, Zarathil could see the sleek form of the human vessel, its design surprisingly elegant despite being built by such an aesthetically challenged species. Perhaps they had received help from more advanced beings, she thought. Or maybe they simply copied designs they had seen from other civilizations. A boarding tube extended from the station to connect with the human ship, creating a secure pathway for the visitors to enter. The crowd pressed closer, curiosity overcoming their disgust as they prepared to see living humans for the first time. Some beings held recording devices, wanting to document this historic moment for their home worlds. The first figure to emerge from the boarding tube was a human female wearing what appeared to be formal diplomatic clothing. Even through her protective visor, Zarathil could see the creature's disturbing asymmetrical features and the strange protein strands hanging from her head in an organized pattern. This was Ambassador Lisa Carter, according to the briefing materials Zarathil had studied. Behind the ambassador came another human, this one male, and wearing what looked like a military uniform of some kind. This would be Captain Jake Martinez, the ambassador's security escort and aide. His face bore the same primitive features as all humans, with the additional horror of dark protein strands covering the lower portion of his facial area. The moment the humans became fully visible to the crowd, the reaction was immediate and dramatic. Several beings from the Gossamer Confederation, whose species valued visual harmony above all else, let out piercing wails and began backing away from the welcoming party. A group of Crystalline Federation representatives started making clicking sounds that indicated extreme distress in their language. Ambassador Carter appeared to notice the crowd's reaction, and Zarathil watched with fascination as the humans' facial features shifted in what their cultural briefings had described as emotional expression. The creature's mouth curved downward, and her optical organs seemed to lose some of their brightness. It was a disturbing display that made Zarathil grateful for her protective visor. Captain Martinez stepped slightly forward, positioning himself between the ambassador and the increasingly agitated crowd. His hand moved to rest on a device attached to his side, though he made no aggressive movements. Through her visor, Zarathil could see that his facial expression had become more alert and focused, primitive features arranging themselves in what she supposed was their version of defensive readiness. Commander Horthick stepped forward to begin the formal welcome ceremony, his massive stone form creating a buffer between the humans and the crowd. His voice boomed through the chamber as he began the traditional greeting ritual used for all new species. On behalf of the Galactic Council and all civilized beings, he intoned, we welcome you to Nexus Prime and invite you to share in the fellowship of advanced civilizations. Ambassador Carter stepped forward to respond, and as she did, several more species in the crowd began showing signs of distress. A group of vapor dancers started dispersing into their mist forms, unable to maintain cohesion while exposed to human appearance. The symmetrical alliance representatives turned away completely, their perfectly ordered formations disrupting as they tried to avoid looking at the humans directly. Thank you for this warm welcome, Ambassador Carter replied, her voice carrying strange tonal variations that humans apparently used for communication. We come in peace and friendship, hoping to learn from your great civilizations and contribute what we can to the galactic community. The formal part of the ceremony called for a traditional hand-joining gesture between the station commander and the visiting ambassador. This ancient ritual symbolized the peaceful intentions of both parties and their willingness to work together. However, as Ambassador Carter extended her hand toward Commander Horthick, the massive being hesitated visibly. Zarathil watched with growing satisfaction as the commander's reluctance became obvious to everyone in the chamber. Even he, with all his authority and diplomatic training, could not bring himself to make physical contact with the humans. The sight of those primitive appendages with their crude digits and rough skin was apparently too much even for his professional composure. When Commander Horthick finally forced himself to complete the gesture, grasping the human's hand briefly before quickly releasing it, several beings in the crowd began making sounds of approval. They appreciated seeing their leader struggle with the same revulsion they all felt. But then something unexpected happened that changed the entire atmosphere of the ceremony. A small being from the delicate collective, no larger than a human, child and with gossamer wings that caught the light beautifully, stumbled and fell as the crowd pressed backward. The creature's delicate form tumbled toward the hard metal floor of the docking bay, and its high-pitched cry of distress cut through all other sounds in the chamber. Not without hesitation, Captain Martinez moved. His response was so quick that even Zarathil, who had been watching him carefully, was surprised by the speed of his reaction. The human dropped to one knee and caught the falling being gently in his arms, his movements careful and controlled despite the urgency of the situation. For a moment, the entire chamber fell silent as everyone stared at this unexpected scene. The tiny being looked up at Captain Martinez with large, luminous eyes, and instead of showing fear or disgust at being touched by a human, it made soft chirping sounds that indicated gratitude in its species language. Zarathil found herself staring at the captain's face as he carefully helped the small creature back to its feet. Through her protective visor, she could see his expression clearly, and something about it struck her as different from what she had expected. Instead of the primitive aggression or selfish concern she had been taught to expect from humans, his features showed what appeared to be genuine worry and care for the well-being of a complete stranger. The moment passed quickly as other beings rushed forward to help the small creature, and the ceremony continued with the humans being escorted to their assigned quarters in the lower levels of the station. But as the crowd dispersed and normal activities resumed, Zarathil found herself thinking about what she had witnessed. Later that evening, she filed her report with the station commander, recommending that all future human visits require full body coverings and voice modulators to make their presence more tolerable for civilized species. She included detailed observations about the crowd's negative reactions and suggested that the humans be restricted to specific areas of the station where other beings would not have to encounter them accidentally. But as she completed her official duties and prepared for her rest cycle, Zarathil could not stop thinking about the expression she had seen on Captain Martinez's face when he helped the fallen creature. It had been just a brief moment, but something about it seemed to contradict everything she had been taught about human nature and behavior. 3 days had passed since the humans arrived at Nexus Prime, and the station had settled into an uneasy routine. Most species had learned to avoid the lower levels where Ambassador Carter and Captain Martinez were housed, and the few necessary interactions were conducted through holographic communications or with maximum protective equipment. Zarathil had successfully avoided any direct contact with the humans, though she found herself oddly curious about their daily activities. She was reviewing cultural exchange proposals in her office when the first tremor shook the station. The vibration was subtle at first, barely enough to disturb the crystal formations that decorated her workspace. But within seconds, it grew stronger, causing the lights to flicker and several delicate ornaments to fall from their display shelves. Zarathil's crystalline body immediately shifted to an alarmed yellow color as she tried to understand what was happening. The station's emergency communication system crackled to life, and Commander Horthicke's voice filled every corridor and chamber with urgent instructions. "All beings proceed to emergency stations immediately," the commander's voice boomed through the speakers. "We have experienced a critical failure in the primary power core. Evacuation protocols are now in effect for all non-essential personnel." The words had barely finished when a massive explosion rocked the entire station. The blast was so powerful that Zarathil was thrown from her chair, her crystal form skittering across the floor as debris rained down from the ceiling. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in an eerie red glow that made the floating dust and smoke look like blood in the air. Zarathil struggled to her feet, her left leg sending sharp pain signals through her nervous system. Looking down, she could see that several crystal segments had cracked, creating fracture lines that ran up her thigh. Crystal beings healed slowly from such injuries, and the pain was considerable. But she knew she had to reach the evacuation points before the situation got worse. She stumbled toward her office door, but found that the explosion had warped the frame, jamming the exit shut. The emergency communication system was now broadcasting automated warnings about toxic gas leaks and structural collapse throughout multiple sections of the station. Her office was located in Sector 7, which, according to the warnings, was one of the areas most severely affected by the explosion. Using her emergency tools, Zarathil managed to force the door open partially, but the corridor beyond was filled with smoke and debris. She could hear the sounds of other beings calling for help, some trapped in their own offices or caught under fallen structural elements. The station's rescue teams would be overwhelmed trying to reach everyone in time. As she squeezed through the partially open door, a section of ceiling collapsed behind her, completely blocking her office exit. The corridor was a maze of fallen support beams and twisted metal, with sparks flying from damaged electrical systems. The air was growing thick with toxic fumes from ruptured chemical storage units, making it difficult for her to breathe properly. Zarathil tried to follow the evacuation route she had memorized during her safety training, but found that most passages were blocked or too dangerous to navigate. Her injured leg made movement slow and painful, and she could feel her strength fading as the toxic gases affected her system. Crystal beings were particularly vulnerable to certain chemical compounds, and she recognized the symptoms of serious poisoning beginning to affect her consciousness. She managed to reach what had once been a maintenance junction, but found herself trapped when another structural collapse blocked the main evacuation route. The only way forward was through a narrow maintenance shaft that led toward the station's outer hull. The opening was barely wide enough for a being of her size, and she could see that it was partially filled with debris and possibly unstable. As her condition worsened, Zarathil activated her personal emergency beacon, hoping that rescue teams would be able to locate her before the toxic exposure became fatal. She crawled into the maintenance shaft as far as she could manage, but her injured leg made progress extremely slow. The pain was becoming overwhelming, and the chemical fumes were making her thoughts fuzzy and confused. She found herself wedged in a section where the shaft had been compressed by the explosion, unable to move forward or backward. Her crystalline body was stuck between twisted metal plates, and every attempt to free herself only caused more pain from her fractured leg. The emergency beacon was still transmitting, but she could hear no sounds of approaching rescue teams. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as she lay trapped in the narrow space, her consciousness fading in and out as the toxic gases continued to affect her system. She began to think that she might not survive this disaster, that her body would be found days later when the rescue teams finally managed to clear all the debris. The irony was not lost on her that she might die on the same station where those ugly humans were staying. Then, Through the haze of pain and confusion, she heard something that seemed impossible. Someone was calling out, and the voice was getting closer. But the sounds were coming from deeper in the damaged areas, from sections that should have been impossible for the rescue teams to reach. The voice was speaking in a language she recognized, but had hoped never to hear directly. It was a human voice. Through the smoke and debris, she could hear movement as someone crawled through spaces even smaller than the one she was trapped in. The voice kept calling out, following the signal from her emergency beacon, getting closer despite the obvious danger of the unstable structure around them. "Hello, can you hear me?" the voice called in the basic galactic language, though, with the strange accent that marked it as human speech. "I'm following your emergency signal. Keep making noise if you can, so I can find you." Zarathil tried to respond, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. The toxic gases had affected her vocal cords, making it difficult to produce the musical tones of her native language. Instead, she managed to tap against the metal walls of the shaft, creating a rhythmic sound that would guide her rescuer toward her location. The sounds of movement grew closer, accompanied by the scraping of metal and the occasional grunt of effort, as whoever was coming had to force their way through particularly difficult passages. She could hear debris being moved aside, and the sound of someone squeezing through openings that seemed impossibly small. When she finally saw the figure emerging through the smoke and darkness, her first instinct was disbelief. Captain Jake Martinez was crawling toward her, his uniform torn and dirty, his face streaked with blood from numerous cuts where sharp metal had scraped against his skin. He had removed some kind of breathing apparatus from his face, apparently sacrificing his own protection to be able to call out to trapped survivors. For the first time in her life, Zarathil was looking at a human face without any protective filters or barriers between them. She had expected to feel the same revulsion and disgust that had filled her during the welcome ceremony, but instead she found herself focusing on something entirely different. His expression showed complete determination and focus, with no trace of the selfishness or primitive behavior she had been taught to expect from his species. "I found you," he said, his voice rough from breathing the toxic air but filled with relief. "I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to stay conscious if you can. This structure isn't stable, and we need to move carefully." Captain Martinez began working to free her from the compressed metal that held her trapped, his movements careful and precise despite the obvious urgency of the situation. His hands, which she had thought looked so crude and primitive, worked with surprising skill and gentleness as he manipulated the debris around her without causing additional injury to her fractured leg. As he worked, Zarathil found herself studying his face in a way she had never expected to do with any human. The lines around his eyes spoke of someone who spent time outdoors under natural sunlight, and the small scar above his left eyebrow suggested experiences and challenges that had shaped his character. His features, which she had dismissed as asymmetrical and ugly, seemed to shift and change as his emotions played across them, creating an almost hypnotic display of expression and feeling. "Almost got it," he said, carefully lifting a piece of twisted metal that had been pinning her leg. "Can you move now? We need to get out of here before more of this section collapses." With Captain Martinez supporting her weight, Zarathil managed to crawl out of the compressed section of the maintenance shaft. Her leg sent waves of pain through her system with every movement, but she found strength she did not know she possessed, perhaps drawn from the determination she could see in her rescuer's face. The journey back through the damaged areas of the station was slow and dangerous, with Captain Martinez constantly checking the stability of their path and helping her navigate obstacles that would have been impossible for her to handle alone. He never complained about the difficulty or expressed any hesitation about risking his own safety to help her reach the evacuation areas. The medical bay on Nexus Prime had been converted into an emergency treatment center following the power core explosion. Beings from dozens of species filled the available beds and treatment areas, their various forms creating a landscape of suffering that the medical staff worked tirelessly to address. Zara lay on a specialized platform designed for crystalline beings, her fractured leg encased in a healing matrix that would slowly repair the damaged crystal segments over the coming days. The toxic gas exposure had been treated with filtration therapy, but her thoughts remained clearer than they had been in the immediate aftermath of the accident. She found herself replaying the rescue over and over in her mind, focusing particularly on the face of Captain Martinez as he had worked to free her from the collapsed maintenance shaft. The memory was vivid and strangely compelling, so different from what she had expected to feel when looking at a human without protective barriers. 3 days had passed since the rescue, and Zara had learned that Captain Martinez had saved 17 other beings from the damaged sections of the station. He had volunteered for the most dangerous rescue missions, crawling through unstable areas that the regular rescue teams could not safely navigate. Several beings owed their lives to his actions, yet none of them had requested to meet with him. Afterward, apparently still too disturbed by his appearance to express their gratitude directly, Dr. Velinara, the Velthari medical specialist overseeing Zarathel's treatment, had commented with obvious distaste about having a human involved in the rescue operations. She spoke of contamination protocols and the need to sanitize any areas where Captain Martinez had been present. Her words carried the typical prejudices of their people, but they struck Zarathel differently now than they would have a week earlier. Against all her cultural training and personal instincts, Zarathel found herself wanting to speak with Captain Martinez again. She told herself it was simply to express proper gratitude for his actions, but she knew there was something more to her curiosity. The brief glimpses she had caught of his face during the rescue had shown her something unexpected, something that challenged everything she had been taught about humans and their primitive nature. She submitted a formal request through the station's communication system, asking if Captain Martinez would be willing to visit her in the medical bay. The request went against every protocol her people had established for interacting with humans, and she half expected him to refuse or for the yaw station administration to deny the meeting for safety reasons. To her surprise, the response came back within hours. Captain Martinez had agreed to the meeting and would visit during the next scheduled visiting period. Dr. Velinara was horrified when she learned about the planned meeting and tried to convince Zarathil to reconsider, warning about the psychological trauma that could result from extended exposure to human appearance. When the appointed time arrived, Zarathil found herself strangely nervous as she waited in the medical bay's private consultation room. She had requested that no protective visors or filtering devices be present, wanting to see Captain Martinez clearly without any technological barriers. The decision felt both terrifying and necessary, though she could not fully explain why. Door chimed softly as it opened, and Captain Martinez entered the room. He looked different than he had during the emergency, cleaned up and wearing a fresh uniform, but the same basic features that had disturbed her so much during the welcome ceremony. However, as she looked at him now, without the panic and confusion of the accident situation, Zarathel began to notice details she had missed before. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice carrying what she was beginning to recognize as genuine concern. "The medical staff said your leg should heal completely, but that crystal fractures can be quite painful." As he spoke, Zarathel found herself watching the way his facial features moved and changed with his words and emotions. What she had previously seen as ugly asymmetry now appeared to be something far more complex and interesting. The slight differences between the left and right sides of his face created a dynamic quality that her own perfectly symmetrical features could never achieve. "I am recovering well," she replied, her musical voice carrying notes of curiosity that she hoped he would not notice. "I wanted to thank you personally for what you did during the accident. Your actions saved my life and the lives of many others." Captain Martinez made a gesture with his shoulders that she recognized from her cultural briefings as a human expression of modesty. Anyone would have done the same thing in that situation. We all look out for each other, regardless of what species we belong to. His words struck her as significant, particularly the casual way he included all species in his concept of community and mutual responsibility. In Velthari society, such feelings of obligation were typically reserved for other members of their own race, with other species being regarded as separate and less important. "I have been wondering about something," Zarathil said, surprising herself with her boldness. "During the rescue, your face showed expressions that I did not expect to see from a human. You seemed to care about my welfare, even though we had never met and belonged to different species." Captain Martinez tilted his head slightly, another gesture. She was learning to interpret as thoughtful consideration. "Why would that surprise you? You were hurt and in danger. It doesn't matter what you look like or where you come from. Helping someone in that situation is just the right thing to do." The simplicity of his response was both touching and disturbing to Zarathil. Everything in her cultural background told her that beings prioritized their own kind and that cross-species cooperation was primarily a matter of political necessity rather than genuine care. Yet Captain Martinez spoke as if concern for others was a natural and automatic response, regardless of biological or cultural differences. "Tell me about human concepts of beauty," she found herself asking, though she had not planned to broach such a personal topic. "Your people seem to have different standards than most other species in the galaxy." A smile spread across Captain Martinez's face, an expression that transformed his features in a way that Zarathil found surprisingly pleasant to observe. She had read about humans smiling in her cultural briefings, but seeing it in person was entirely different from the clinical descriptions she had studied. "Beauty means different things to different humans," he explained, his voice taking on a warmer tone. "We tend to find meaning in imperfection and character in the marks that life leaves on us. This scar above my eye, for example, came from protecting a friend during a training accident. To me, it represents something important about who I am and what I value." He gestured toward the small mark she had noticed during the rescue, and Zarathil found herself looking at it with new understanding. Instead of seeing it as a flaw or sign of damage, she began to perceive it as a record of experience and character, something that told a story about the person who bore it. "Your people prize symmetry and mathematical perfection," Captain Martinez continued. "That creates one kind of beauty, but it's static and unchanging. Human faces tell stories through their imperfections, showing laughter and sorrow, determination and compassion. Every line and mark represents experiences that have shaped us into who we are." As he spoke, Zarathil studied his face with growing fascination. The lines around his eyes did seem to suggest someone who smiled frequently, while the set of his jaw indicated determination and strength. His features were indeed asymmetrical, but rather than creating ugliness, the variations seemed to add depth and character that her own perfect crystal features lacked. "On my homeworld," Captain Martinez said, "we have landscapes that are considered beautiful precisely because they are irregular and unpredictable. Mountains with jagged peaks, rivers that wind in unexpected directions, forests where no two trees are exactly alike. We find beauty in diversity and change rather than in perfect order." The concept was revolutionary to Zarathil, who had been raised to believe that beauty came from mathematical harmony and flawless symmetry. The idea that irregularity and imperfection could be aesthetically valuable was almost impossible for her to process. Yet as she looked at Captain Martinez's face, she began to see hints of what he meant. "I think I am beginning to understand," she said slowly, her voice carrying notes of wonder that surprised them both. "Your faces are like living art that changes with every emotion and experience." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering topics from human culture to interspecies cooperation to personal philosophies about life and beauty. Zarathel found herself completely absorbed in the discussion, forgetting entirely about her previous disgust with human appearance. Instead, she was discovering a form of beauty she had never imagined could exist, one based on expression and character rather than physical perfection. When Captain Martinez finally prepared to leave, Zara felt something she had never experienced before, a sense of disappointment that their conversation was ending. She had learned more about beauty and character in this single meeting than in centuries of studying Velthari aesthetic theory. Word of Captain Martinez's heroic actions during the power core explosion had spread throughout Nexus Prime like ripples through still water. Beings who had initially recoiled from the humans began whispering among themselves about the courage and selflessness displayed during the rescue operations. Some species started questioning their initial judgments, though many others remained firmly convinced that physical appearance reflected moral character. Zarathil had been released from the medical bay with her leg fully healed, but the conversations with Captain Martinez had left her mind in a state of constant turmoil. Everything she had believed about beauty, worth, and the nature of civilization was crumbling around her like the damaged sections of the station that were still being repaired. She found herself unable to focus on her regular duties as she struggled with ideas that challenged the very foundation of her worldview. The Velthari Council of Aesthetics had sent several urgent messages demanding a full report on her interactions with the humans. They had heard rumors about her meeting with Captain Martinez and were deeply concerned about potential contamination of her aesthetic judgment. The council expected her to confirm their initial assessment that humans were visually offensive and should be restricted from civilized society. Instead of writing the report they expected, Zarathel spent her time researching human culture and philosophy through the station's database. She studied their art, their literature, and their concepts of beauty with growing fascination. What she discovered challenged everything her people had taught her about the relationship between appearance and worth. The breaking point came when she received a direct communication from the Velthari High Council. They had decided to formally propose that humans be banned from all major galactic facilities and restricted to remote trading posts, where other species would not have to encounter them. They wanted Zarathil to present this proposal to the Galactic Council as an official recommendation from the Cultural Liaison Program. As she read the proposal, Zarathil felt her crystalline body shift through colors she had never experienced before. The anger and disgust were familiar emotions, but they were now directed at her own people rather than at the humans. The document described Captain Martinez and Ambassador Carter in terms that made them sound like dangerous animals rather than intelligent beings who had risked their lives to help others. That evening, Zarathel made a decision that would change her life forever. She requested time to address the full assembly of beings currently stationed on Nexus Prime. The request was unusual enough that Commander Horthick granted it immediately, curious about what the normally reserved cultural liaison wanted to discuss. In such a public forum, the main assembly hall was packed with representatives from dozens of species. When Zarathel took the speaking platform, she could see Captain Martinez and Ambassador Carter sitting in the back section designated for human visitors, their faces showing polite interest despite knowing that most discussions in these forums were about restricting their activities or limiting their access to galactic society. Zarathel looked out over the crowd and felt a moment of panic as she realized what she was about to do. She was going to reject centuries of her people's beliefs and teachings in front of beings from across the galaxy. The personal consequences would be severe, but she knew she could not remain silent. While injustice was being promoted in the name of aesthetic purity, she reached up and slowly removed her protective visor, the device that had shielded her from direct sight of human faces since their arrival. The action sent a ripple of shock through the assembled beings, many of whom gasped or made sounds of distress at seeing a Valthari expose herself to unfiltered human appearance. "I stand before you today to speak about beauty," Zarathil began, her musical voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems. "For my entire life, I believed that beauty was defined by symmetry, mathematical perfection, and the absence of flaws. I believed that ugly beings were morally inferior, and that appearance reflected the quality of one's character." She paused, looking directly at Captain Martinez as she continued. 3 days ago, Captain Jake Martinez risked his life to save mine and the lives of 16 other beings during the power core explosion. When I looked at his face during that rescue, I saw something that challenged everything I thought I knew about beauty and worth. The crowd began murmuring among themselves, with some beings expressing shock at her words, while others seemed intrigued by her unexpected perspective. Several Velthari representatives in the audience were pulsing with angry red colors, clearly disturbed by what they were hearing from one of their own people. I discovered that true beauty is not found in perfect features or flawless symmetry. Zarathil continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. It is found in the courage to help a stranger, in the compassion to risk your own safety for others, and in the strength to do what is right, even when it is difficult or dangerous. She gestured toward the human section of the assembly hall. Captain Martinez's face tells the story of a life spent helping others. The lines around his eyes speak of laughter and joy shared with friends. The scar above his eyebrow represents a moment when he chose to protect someone else at cost to himself. These imperfections that we call ugly are actually marks of character and experience that make him more beautiful than any perfect crystal formation. The reaction from the crowd was immediate and intense. Some beings began calling out in agreement, while others shouted in protest. The Velthari delegation stood up in unison and began walking toward the exits, their crystalline forms pulsing with colors that indicated extreme displeasure and rejection. Ambassador Vexter from the Zephyrian Empire rose from his seat and pointed, an accusing appendage at Zarathil. "This being has clearly been mentally contaminated by exposure to human appearance," he declared in his metallic voice. "Her judgment can no longer be trusted, and her words should be disregarded as the ravings of someone whose aesthetic sense has been corrupted." But other voices in the crowd began supporting Zarathil's position. A representative from the Gossamer Confederation stood up and spoke about how Captain Martinez had gently rescued one of their young during the evacuation, showing a tenderness that contradicted all their assumptions about human nature. A being from the Crystalline Federation admitted that the humans' actions during the crisis had demonstrated qualities they claimed to value in their own society. As the debate continued around her, Zara felt a sense of peace settling over her consciousness. She had spoken her truth regardless of the consequences, and she could see that her words were reaching at least some of the beings in the assembly. The change in perspective she had experienced was beginning to spread to others. Commander Horth Ek eventually called for order and announced that all proposals regarding human restrictions would be postponed pending further review. The assembly was dismissed, but many beings remained in small groups, continuing their discussions about beauty, character, and the relationship between appearance and worth. As the crowd dispersed, Captain Martinez approached Zarathil at the speaking platform. His face showed the warm expression she had learned to recognize as gratitude, but there was also something deeper in his eyes that spoke of understanding and respect. "Thank you," he said simply. "What you did today took tremendous courage. You risked everything to stand up for what you believe is right." Zarathul looked at his face, seeing it now without any barriers or preconceptions. The features that had once seemed so alien and disturbing now appeared rich with character and meaning. She could see the intelligence in his eyes, the kindness in his smile, and the strength in the set of his jaw. "I discovered that the most beautiful thing of all," she replied, "is the courage to see beyond surface appearances and recognize the deeper beauty in all conscious beings. You taught me that beauty comes not from perfect features, but from perfect actions." In the days that followed, Zarathil faced the consequences of her public statement. The Velthari Council formally expelled her from their society, declaring her aesthetically contaminated and unfit to represent their people. She lost her position as cultural liaison and was banned from returning to her homeworld. But she also discovered that she was not alone in her new understanding. Several other beings on the station began removing their protective visors when interacting with humans. An informal discussion. Groups formed to explore new concepts of beauty and worth that went beyond physical appearance. Captain Martinez and Ambassador Carter completed their diplomatic missions successfully, with several species voting to welcome humans into the galactic community despite ongoing opposition from others. As they prepared to depart Nexus Prime, Captain Martinez sought out Zarachel one final time. They met in the station's observation deck, looking out at the stars through the massive transparent barriers that separated them from the vacuum of space. Zarathel had accepted a new position working with refugees and displaced beings, helping them find acceptance in communities that might initially reject them based on appearance or cultural differences. "I want you to know," Captain Martinez said, "that what you did changed more than just policies and regulations. You changed how people think,